Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us and for being patient. Apologies, we are about 2 minutes late to begin this. But nevertheless, good morning to our friends who are joining us from the European time zone and from UK as well. We also have with us today friends and patrons and clients joining from Hong Kong and Singapore. So a very good evening to you as well. Today's topic would be focused on sports, and it's based on COVID-19 and its impact on global sports. And we are here to give you certain legal perspectives on it today. Along with me, joining on this panel are two of my colleagues and one guest speaker from CMS London. Let me do a quick round of introduction for each one of them. From the Nishith Desai team, I have Mr. Moazzam Khan, who is the Global Head of Litigation based out of our Delhi office. I've got Abhishek Senthilnathan. He's from our Mumbai office, a senior member of the Media Entertainment and the Sports Practice Group. And I've got our friend and colleague from the fraternity from CMS London, David Zeffman. He's the partner and the head of media of gaming and sports at CMS London. Thank you so much, David, for having made time for us and joining us today. We're absolutely delighted to have you with us today.
Delighted to be with you too.
Absolutely. While a lot of you probably already seen Abhishek, Moazzam, and I at a number of other sessions, I'd like to probably just introduce David a little bit more. So David has been one of the leading lawyers in the UK media sector for over 25 years now, and he has extensive experience in providing strategic, commercial, and regulatory advice to clients in the gambling, sports, and television sectors. And he's been involved in many major transactions that have been in place for these sectors, including launch of several television channels and sale of media rights to some of the world's biggest sporting companies. I think that explains very well why today's session is going to be extremely interesting, extremely intriguing. David's presence has been absolutely apt for it. So, quickly moving on to what we're going to be discussing today. Over the last few days, my colleagues and some of our other guest speakers have deliberated and debated on multiple facets of entertainment. While on-demand platforms and online gaming platforms have definitely seen an unprecedented surge in their viewership and participation, there is also the other parts of entertainment like live sports and movie production, which have taken a negative hit in the face of this pandemic. Today, our session will be focused on how COVID-19 has been a true game changer for global sports. Each day brings with it news of different sporting bodies and organizations taking different steps towards this pandemic. World over, experts are believing that the economic structure of international cricket is likely to change. Probably lower ranked nations are going to even face a crunch in their funds. Probably some lesser known sports like maybe hockey, they are going to have a very uncertain future as well. Now, the key revenue generation for sport bodies typically across the world is through licensing of broadcasting rights for television and internet. With the stoppage of the live events itself, it is likely that a number of these sporting bodies are going to have challenges at the time of renewal of these contracts. Financial hits are bound to happen. Perhaps countries like India and UK, being the bigger guns in this industry, are lesser likely to face the same kind of an impact. But smaller countries like West Indies, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka might have a different story to tell. Especially in the Indian context, we are a cricket crazy nation, and it will be probably apt to talk about how experts believe that cancellation of a mega tournament like IPL is going to cost BCCI, the tournament broadcasters and the franchisees, probably a little north of at least $500,000. Now that's a lot of money we're talking about. And even more than the cancellation of the tournament itself, there are a chain of industries which are bound to be affected. Support staff, logistic companies, airlines, hotels, all benefit from these kind of tournaments and are likely to face the brunt as well. Well, medical experts have also said that while mass testing of players, officials, and the audience in these stadiums is probably the way to go, practically impossible at the moment. So return of sports is going to take some bit of time. Moving on from there, probably is the right time to mention how we're going to be structuring our session today and how our panelists are going to respond to different facets that we will take up. It's a limited session of 1 hour today, so we probably can't touch base on every single point that you'd like to hear from us. But there are certain aspects that we thought, combined with the expertise that this panel has and the information that you would like to know about, we have cherry-picked about 8 or 10 top questions that we believe we should be responding today. We'll begin our discussions with understanding a bit about the status of the different sporting tournaments across the world and the approach that the different sporting bodies and nations have been taking. We'll then segue our conversation into a little bit about the contractual relationships, which have probably seen the maximum impact, and how are different concepts like force majeure, termination of contracts, and negotiations playing out for these kind of contractual relationships. David and our team are going to give you both the UK as well as the Indian law perspective to this. We'll try and touch base a bit on the consequences of termination under these agreements to throw a little light of how we see things moving forward. We do have an expert on litigation as well, so we will also address a couple of questions on how we see the dispute resolution to work moving forward for this. And lastly, but not at all the least, the different risks and issues that you would need to contemplate if you're looking at moving forward in the latter half of the year and starting the tournaments as live sports again. So with that, let's move on right into our discussion. Abhishek, probably I should begin this one with you. The pandemic obviously has had very far-reaching effects all across the world. It's at different stages of, being dealt with in different countries of the world. Now, presumably, a different approach should be taken towards sports as well in these countries. Could you probably just give us a very quick snapshot of some of the top tournaments as well as some of the countries as to how are they dealing with sporting tournaments and what's the status around the world?
Sure, Ranjana, thanks. So I think we can probably break this up into around 4 major buckets and cover a few events under each of these approaches. And the 4 buckets would be basically the step of either cancelling tournaments in their entirety. The second one would be where tournaments have temporarily been suspended or delayed to a future date. The third bucket would be tournaments which have actually been restarted again in certain countries with a specific set of rules and instructions. And also there are certain tournaments which have been ongoing, certain events which have been going on for the past 2-3 months, even while there have been lockdowns enforced in the countries where the tournaments are based. So touching upon the first one, broadly now when you think about events that have been cancelled, one of the most prominent events was the Wimbledon Lawn Tennis Championships for this year, where the Wimbledon Association in itself effectively cancelled the entire tournament, citing the COVID-19 pandemic as an extenuating circumstance. And I think the rationale behind this also was that because Wimbledon attracts such a large international fan base and a lot of people travel to England and London to watch the tournament, the authorities there thought that the best step to take would be actually cancelling the entire tournament in its entirety. And what may have pushed them down this line also is for everyone's knowledge that Wimbledon effectively is one of the first sporting events which had the concept of a pandemic already in its insurance policies. So there was a backstop for Wimbledon when it took these steps where they're able to claim certain benefits from their insurance policies. So the event in itself was entirely cancelled. And another similar event also on a large scale which was cancelled is in football, where the League One, which is the French National Football League, was effectively cancelled 2 weeks ago when the French government came out and made statements that no live sporting events would be allowed to happen even without fans and in closed stadiums till the end of August and the beginning of September. So the current ongoing season of the French Football League was voided in its entirety, and teams which were in their own specific positions in the leagues were awarded either the championship or relegation, and scrapping of teams to a lower league was scrapped. Now, moving on to the second bucket of events which have been suspended but not cancelled, I think we can first obviously cover the most important and well-known one, which is the Olympics, which was scheduled to be held this year in 2020 in Tokyo. And the Indian International Olympic Association has, as of now, currently shifted the Olympics and have stated that it will be scheduled in 2021. But with recent sort of news interviews that have been made by the head of the International Olympic Association and for organizing the Olympics, the feeling is that if the pandemic cannot be effectively contained, there is a very high likelihood that the Olympics in themselves would be entirely cancelled and won't even happen next year because of the logistics involved in the people traveling all over. One of the largest events for bicycle racing in the world. As per recent reports, considering that the French government has suspended live events till September, the organizers of the Tour de France have, rather than cancelling the event, they've acknowledged the value and worth that it brings economically to France and also the global fan base of cycling. They've currently announced that the event is going to be happening late August or 1st September. So these are broadly events which have been suspended to a later date, but it's still unclear whether these events are going to happen or not. Now, the third bucket of events which have been restarted, South Korea and Germany are two countries that have tackled the epidemic in a relatively good manner. And they've also taken steps in the last few weeks of restarting these events. So, for example, in South Korea, the Korean Football League actually held its first live games of its 2019-2020 season the past week, with again strict rules in place where the games were held in empty stadiums and players and coaches who were not involved in the game and were sitting on the touchlines were asked to be masked. And social distancing was also required amongst every single person who was involved or entering the stadium for the events. This included even journalists and people who were covering the event who had to be pre-screened before coming into the stadium. Similarly, also along the same lines, the Bundesliga in Germany is also restarting its league, their football league, which the first games are kicking off in the next 2 days. But again, there have been a lot of debates and issues about this where players have actually been tested positive in the last week prior to the event itself beginning and the league's game starting. So there's a lot of debate around that as well. And just lastly, covering something which has been ongoing throughout the entire 2-3 months, where in the United States, the World Wrestling Federation, which is a sort of sports entertainment company, has actually been holding its live events on a weekly basis and producing and telecasting its shows. And the interesting point here is they've been actually essential service by the governor of the state of California, which has allowed them to continue, holding their events and involving their employees and superstars in their events, with the only rider being that they've implemented a policy that any one of their employees who's not comfortable engaging or actually attending and performing has the option of not performing. So these are the broad 4 buckets of what's been happening, at least worldwide, when it comes to sporting events.
What I hear from you is tied up with the larger plans that every country has, plus how far have they reached in tackling COVID as a pandemic in general has really influenced the decision of each sporting body. And what I interestingly also heard from you was a point of insurance policies, but probably that's something I'll take up with you a little later in this session because it's something which will really tickle everyone's interests. But I'm going to move on to David from here. And David, I know that you've got extensive experience in advising clients across the board in this industry, right from broadcasters, sporting organizations, government associations. But I'm going to break my question into halves for you to make this simpler for the audience, really. Let's take up the sporting authorities and the bodies first up. You've been advising a number of them, especially at this time of the pandemic. What are the kind of issues that they're really talking about? And, where are people really moving in terms of taking the decisions? Obviously, I can understand there are going to be issues where you can't really disclose the names. That's fine. But do give us an indication of your experience around this area.
Sure. Thanks, Ranjana. So, just to explain our involvement in this area. So in 2014, we advised the ICC on their media rights auction at the time, and they were selling the worldwide rights for international cricket, the Cricket World Cup and so on, for 2015 to 2023. Then in 2017, we advised the ECB, the England and Wales Cricket Board, on their media rights auction for 2020 to 2024. And although I know we're going to come on a bit more to broadcasting in a bit, really for premium sports, so by which I mean English Premier League, international cricket, Formula One, there is a huge degree of interdependence between those premium level sports and the broadcasters, because the sports need the income to fund their sport and the participants, and the broadcasters need content from the premium sports to generate subscription revenues and advertising revenues. And then you get sponsorship that follows on from the broadcast exposure of the sport. And below that premium tier, it's much more about attendances, although broadcasting income is still important. So in the current crisis, not so much a game changer as a game canceller, I think. Premium sports, the governing bodies, have been looking at their broadcasting contracts in particular to see how the force majeure clause operates. Does it bite on the pandemic? And usually the answer is going to be yes, but it's not as simple as that. It's then, well, what's the consequence of force majeure clause applying? And I think we'll probably get into that a little bit more later as well. But the question from the sports governing body will be, is the broadcaster still obliged to pay? Because without that income, my sport's going to be in trouble. If matches aren't played, is the broadcaster going to be entitled to a rebate? If the force majeure event continues beyond a certain period, can the broadcaster terminate the contract, etc., etc.? Now, whilst these are in the normal contractual sense, adversarial when you're advising the different parties, I think the reality is that there is such a mutual interdependence between the sport and the broadcaster that it's in their mutual interest to find a way where they can of finishing the season, rescheduling the matches, coming up with alternative content. So having asked me not to talk about broadcasting, obviously that's all I've been talking about. But the effect of broadcasting on the premium sports is so important. So if you take the English Premier League, when it last sold its rights for 3 seasons, it generated £9.2 billion. Without that income, how do you fund the exorbitant player salaries? What happens to transfer fees? It's the fuel for the whole engine of the sport and the mechanics of playing the game and the players. So at the moment, the sports are looking at how they can preserve their income. The broadcasters are looking at how they can preserve their content. But obviously, you can't do any of that without the participation of the players and also without the government sanction. I'd never heard before, by the way, Abhishek, that World WWF was an essential event, but there you go. And obviously, even if you've got government sanction, it's got to be safe for the players to train and then to participate. And depending on the sport, that's, greater or lesser difficulty. So if you take something like horse racing, which is probably going to be one of the first sports to resume in the UK, it will resume behind closed doors, but you don't have, you don't have players standing next to each other to protect a free kick or hugging each other when they score a goal. That's probably going to be a bit less anyway. But you can have what is the phrase that a lot of people are using at the moment, a biosecure environment. It'll be closed off. There's a limited number of people who can attend. You'll probably have racing resuming on those race courses where there is an adjacent hotel. So all the participants will live in that hotel for a period whilst the racing is taking place, and for a few days before and a few days after, and so on. And I think the other issue in all of this is sort of public perception. So one of the last big sports events to happen in England before lockdown started was the Cheltenham Horse Racing Festival, where there were 60,000 people a day attending in quite close quarters. I was one of them. And actually, certainly the whole coronavirus events, it moved very quickly. And I think probably by day 2 of Cheltenham, everyone was thinking, really, should this still be happening? But, and I think before sports resume, they want to make sure that there isn't a sort of public outcry at a sport resuming when lots of businesses still can't operate. The next level of issues you get into is, Abhishek was talking about in France, and I think Netherlands, the season has been cancelled, determined null and void. In Belgium, I think it's been stopped, but the standings are finalised as they are now. What happens to promotion and relegation? What happens to player contracts? So as far as the English Premier League is concerned, player contracts come to an end on a lot of them on 1st of July, but it's likely, well, very likely, that the season, if it is renewed, will be extended beyond 1st of July. So what happens to those players' contracts? What happens to the transfer windows? There was a suggestion that the Premier League would resume only at neutral venues. A lot of the clubs were concerned about, well, that means I'm going to lose home advantage. It might mean that I'm relegated, whereas I wouldn't be if I was playing at my home ground. So there are a myriad of issues that potentially will keep lawyers busy for a long time to come.
Okay, thank you, David. I think what I do hear from you is that you and your team are going to be exceptionally busy, irrespective of whether the live events are happening or not. So that's probably good news for the sports lawyers, but not so good for the live sports events itself. But I think you already touched upon something very interesting, and I'm guessing that the entire audience here would be equally intrigued with it. It's the broadcasting rights bucket, and how do broadcasters look at this? I think we are also keen to know more about this because I think closer to home, you do have bigger products like the Indian Premier League, which have in the last few years had absolutely massive contracts in terms of broadcasting rights for both television and internet being sold. And not just that, they've also contributed in a humongous way to the GDP of the country itself in the last couple of years. Now, given that sports of this nature have had such a huge impact with just the sheer broadcasting rights being sold, it would be very interesting to know that what's happening world over where the broadcasters are concerned. How are they looking at these contracts? Are they treating these as force majeure events? I think what I'd be also keen to hear is, because these are contracts spanning over a couple of years, are people looking at treating 2020 as a 0 year in the contract and adding another year to their repertoire? What's the general approach that people want to take from here?
Okay, so it's probably worth just talking a bit about force majeure. I don't know how it works under Indian law. I'm probably going to learn very shortly. But in the UK, there is no statutory or common law provisions in relation to force majeure. It's entirely, in each case, a matter of what the contract says. So in most cases, force majeure is defined as something beyond the reasonable control of the affected party. And often the contract will list examples, normally non-exhaustive examples of what falls within the category of force majeure. A pandemic, in almost all cases, is going to be an example of something which is a force majeure event. That's far from being the end of it. So you then have to look at, okay, under my force majeure clause, it says that pandemic, such as COVID-19, is a force majeure event. Okay, what are the consequences under the contract? And what a lot of force majeure clauses say is that force majeure applies and party is, the contract is suspended maybe for the period of force majeure if the party is prevented from performing their obligations as a result of the force majeure event. If, for example, and I think this has happened in some cases, the sports governing body decides of its own volition that it's going to postpone or cancel the sports event. Has it been prevented from holding that event as a result of the pandemic? Arguably it hasn't. It's taken its own decision, maybe for commercial reasons, that it doesn't want to go ahead with the event. But it may be that it can't rely on the force majeure clause. In other countries, it's actually been the result of a government order that says you can't have gatherings of more than X number of people. But again, does that mean that you can't hold the event behind closed doors? So there's a lot of focus on whether, or clauses that are drafted that way, whether the sport event organizer is actually prevented from fulfilling its obligations. And even where it's sort of clear that it is in relation to, the government ordering lockdown, no sports events to take place for a period, that's normally for a finite period. But if the sports event organizer has said, well, I'm going to cancel the whole season, it's not actually been prevented from holding the events after the lockdown has ended and the term of the government order has expired. So there's all those kinds of issues. And what, as I say, the sports governing bodies and the broadcasters are looking at is, well, does the broadcaster still have to pay me? Even if they still have to pay me, will they be entitled to a rebate? Are the parties' obligations suspended? Is the effect of force majeure, as you just mentioned this, Ranjana, does it mean that for the period of suspension gets added on at the end of the contract, and so on and so on? And it's entirely, as far as English law is concerned, a matter of construction and interpretation of the contract. But as I said, because for the premium sports and for the dedicated sports broadcasters, this is critical for both of them. Although the contractual provision obviously sets the framework for the discussions between them, it is so much in their mutual interest to find a way of continuing to hold the events and for those events to continue to be broadcast. I think they are working together to find ways of doing so, which may involve scheduling additional events that weren't contemplated. You may find that there's some international cricket matches which weren't on the schedule for this season, which will take place. I mentioned that we advised the English Cricket Board in 2017. So they, under their contracts, which are mainly with Sky, but also with the BBC, they will earn £1.1 billion over the 5 years, the first season being this season, start of which has already been postponed. But also a big part of it was the creation of a new 2020 event called The 100, which is based on the Australian 2020 cricket tournament called the Big Bash, and designed to be on free-to-air TV in the BBC, and designed to appeal to a more sort of family audience. So this season was going to be the first year launch of 100, as it's called, because it's 10 overs of 10 balls each. Anarchic, I know, traditionalists don't like it. Now, 100 actually, the matches are going to take place, or were going to take place in July and August. Now, from a force majeure perspective, and I'm obviously not going to say what the contract actually says, but just from a force majeure perspective, it's likely that by July and August, cricket will be able to hold events at least behind closed doors. But nevertheless, the ECB have already announced that the launch of the 100 this season is going to be cancelled. So the first season of the 100 won't take place until next year. Now, obviously, the ECB wouldn't have done that without discussions with their major broadcast partners. And I think I'll probably leave it there. I suppose the only other legal concept worth a quick mention is frustration. I don't know if that applies under Indian law. You're going to educate me again shortly. You do have this concept in English law, common law doctrine of frustration. But that's interpreted very narrowly by the English courts, and the party's performance of a contract must be rendered physically or commercially impossible or radically different from the obligations undertaken at the inception of the contract. And that's a very high bar to establish. And also, where the parties have got a force majeure clause in their contract, which covers, in this case, the pandemic, well, clearly it was envisaged by the parties that that kind of event may happen. So frustration couldn't apply. It's probably enough from me for the moment.
Yes, we've got a lot reserved for you for later too. But I think, David, a couple of points that really stood out for me. One of the things that you mentioned was about, whatever your contract may say for both the parties, ultimately the commercial ramifications is something which is very important to evaluate for both parties at the end of the day. The reason why you have these sporting events are not just to have the media rights being sold, but both parties get together in the scheme of things, make the revenues as they decided to do so. A lot of devil is in the detail in terms of how the parties have negotiated in terms of even the share of their commercial pie, right? So it's not as easy as to say that it was easy to have a tournament being held because it's not a contact sport or whatever the reason may be, or because the lockdown, doesn't dictate why a sport cannot be played. And a broadcasting could happen. But it is at the end of the day, both parties sitting together at a table and trying to figure out if truly the commercial reason why they decided to enter into this contract would benefit them in the longer run. And would it really be a loss here? So that's a very important thing that you mentioned. And then the other thing that, I was reflecting while you were, telling us about how people are looking at this is that the way that they're probably looking at the tournaments which are going to happen immediately versus the tournaments which are to happen much later in the year when the lockdowns may be taken away, certain countries may be at different phases of handling the pandemic, especially for the global tournaments which are going to happen, and the rights have been sold all across the world. It's going to be a tough one, and an even tougher one for, I guess, the lawyers who are advising them, such as yourselves and us, in terms of advising them that what's the right balance. And perhaps not now. Now everybody's probably a part of the negotiation table, but sooner than later, there could be a lot of issues on the dispute side, which is where I will bring in my colleague Moazzam in the picture as well. But Moazzam, perhaps before we get into the dispute side of things, there was something that David mentioned on the force majeure law for UK. Now, a lot of these contracts are really global in nature, and a lot of them really have an Indian party as well. A lot of times, Indian law is also selective. So to kind of really understand how both the laws would be treated, to get a proper picture of it, it would be helpful to know from you, how does Indian law look at especially force majeure in the case of this pandemic for sporting events?
Sure, thank you. I think the situation is quite similar in India to what David mentioned. And on the question whether a pandemic can be truly treated as a force majeure event from an Indian perspective, fortunately for lawyers around the world, there is no simple yes or no answer to this question. Now, similar to the doctrine of frustration under the English law, there is something under the Indian Contracts Act, which is Section 56, which is called a section dealing with the agreement to do an impossible act. Basically, it says that any agreement or a contract to do anything which is impossible in itself or unlawful is void. So, notwithstanding whether or not your contract has a force majeure clause, Section 56 sort of provides a statutory threshold in India, which basically is the same what I said earlier on, that contract to do anything which is impossible or unlawful becomes void at inception. Now let's analyze this impossibility first, and then we'll get into force majeure. Can one say that because of COVID-19 all contracts have become impossible to perform? The answer is an obvious no, right? So, David mentioned a couple of examples. I'll mention a couple of more. So, for instance, you have a contract to play, let's say, an exhibition match in April 2020. And no other things considered, within India, it will be an impossible contract to perform, considering what happened. Now, relief in such situations is generally given by the court on the ground of, subsequent impossibility, when it finds that the whole purpose or the basis of the contract, which in this case was playing one exhibition match on one particular day, has been frustrated or made impossible by occurrence of an unexpected event of default. But contrast that with another example, which is to play 5 exhibition matches over a course of 5 years. No other things considered, in today's situation, this contract will not be impossible to perform as a whole. Now, there may be situations where an unforeseen event may render performance impossible during a limited period of time, which is essentially what we're seeing right now in a lot of cases, and thereby providing a window to resume the normal contractual obligations after the event ceases to operate. And it's in this concept that force majeure clauses really come into play. You can actually say that a force majeure clause in India adds on to the dimensions of Section 56 of the Indian Contracts Act. The basis of obviously this clause is to save the performing party from consequences arising out of non-performance. Now let's take our second example again. 5 exhibition matches over 5 years. Per se, contract is not impossible to perform. But if now there is a term in the contract which says that pre-agreed timings and dates of each match are the essence of the contract, or that a party is entitled to terminate the contract if performance of any obligation under the contract is delayed, say, beyond 30 days. Now, this may be a situation in which force majeure clause can be invoked by a party to, excuse to escape the liability for non-performance. Of course, the key factor remains to establish a direct link between the causation, between the event and the impossibility to performance, in order to demonstrate that pandemic was the sole cause as to why I was unable to perform the contract. So broadly, this is what the picture under Indian law is in relation to impossibility and force majeure.
Thanks, Moazzam. I think it pretty much, kind of elaborated on the exact concern that I was talking about earlier. But I think I do have another question for you. But just before that, I think, Abhishek, something that I've been wanting to pick your brains on from the start of the session was you mentioned about insurance policies right at the beginning. I wanted to learn from you whether it's something which is commonplace in any kind of sporting contracts to actually be backed up by insurance policies, because that's going to have a direct impact in terms of taking decisions under these contracts too, because ultimately they're all commercially driven. So what's your experience in terms of, having insurance policies as a safeguard in case of termination or these kind of force majeure events in India?
Sure, Ranjana. So generally for sporting events, the most common policy that's taken out that may address this are event cancellation policies, where a lot of these events, a lot of these sports organizers take out specific policies in the case of either suspension or cancellation of events. And that generally covers even the concept of force major events, which is inherently linked to the inability to actually hold the event due to reasons out of control. But when you put this in the context of a pandemic, and this is at least when it comes to Indian insurance companies, what has been found commonly in the last few weeks, there have been a lot of debates and thoughts that have come out on this, is that Indian insurers, at least as a whole, did not sort of factor in this concept of a pandemic when it came to event cancellation policies for sporting events. Because that was not something before what's happened in the past few months was something that was on top of everyone's minds as to that would also be a reason as to how events in their whole can't be held or can be suspended or cancelled. But also now, what a lot of Indian insurers are saying is that going forward, including this as a part of event cancellation policies also would be again very, let's say, dependent on fixing a rate, fixing an amount. The issue is when you talk about cancelling of an event due to a pandemic, one, it's not sure whether it's going to be a complete cancellation of the event and it's not going to be held at a later date, or whether a suspension and having it 1 year later would also trigger the policy as well. So what the thought process or what the thinking now is that the industry needs to decide how would you sort of classify a pandemic under these policies, and what would be the quantum also that the policy of the coverage that it will provide for such events, because all of this is very uncertain. So as I mentioned earlier, it's not a common thing to have this when it came to sporting events. And as far as what's happened till date, Wimbledon is the only event that had this covered in their policy. And I think the thought process for them including this is they relied on the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, because Wimbledon has been held for around more than 100 years. So at that time, it was factored into their thinking and included as a part of their policy.
Thanks, Abhishek. I think it's helpful. My apologies. Okay. Thanks, Abhishek. I think that gives a very helpful perspective, especially for our audience. So, we're looking at it from an Indian perspective. I think, Moazzam, now coming back to what I was, discussing with you earlier. Now, like I said, a lot of these agreements are cross-border in nature, and given that India itself has such a huge market for sports and sports entertainment consumption, especially you have products like IPL as well. There are multiple contracts that, where Indian parties are bound to be involved. Now, given the mix of audience that we have here today, I think there's a looming question on minds of most people that should there be an occasion where actually a dispute does arise, which is not possible to really sit across the table, negotiate, and close it. How really are the Indian courts functioning amidst this entire pandemic that's happening? Of course, there are going to be contracts which have got arbitration as a preferred choice of dispute resolution. But for interim measures, I'm assuming you would always advise our clients to also look at the courts to get speedy decisions being made. So I do want to pick your brain on 2 or 3 very specific aspects with this background. One, are the courts in India open and entertaining matters? Will they be looking at the kind of disputes we're looking at, which are really termination of contract kind of matters? Number 2, what about virtual arbitrations? Is that something picking up in your experience as an alternative mode of dispute resolution? And I think 3, which is going to be an interesting one for all of us, is that would it be a sensible approach to maybe procure interim orders in other countries where the counterparty is based, where both systems may be running better than India? I mean, you're the better judge of this, really. But I think there are a lot of questions here, so that one could really assess how to really strategize the next step forward in the event that negotiation fails, especially if you have an Indian party. Moazzam, over to you.
Yeah, so I think before I answer each one of your, I think, 3 or 4 questions, let me start with a bit of a background. Like you rightly said, in most commercial contracts today, the forum you can actually approach, in the event of a dispute arising between parties is often pre-decided in the contract itself. For instance, most cross-border contracts, most cross-border commercial contracts would set out, whether a party can refer disputes to an arbitration or can approach courts for litigation. And if it's an arbitration, whether it's an institutional arbitration or an ad hoc arbitration seated in India or London or Paris, if it's a pure litigation dispute resolution, whether certain courts have been given exclusive jurisdiction to, resolve disputes emanating out of that particular contract, what is the governing law of the contract, so on and so forth. So these elements are actually more often than not covered in most cross-border commercial contracts. And then there is an entirely separate type of dispute, which is not commercial, so to speak, but may involve, issues of doping, violence on the field, abuse of a referee, ethical disputes relating to sports, which generate a very different type of a dispute, which often goes to certain specialized bodies and not commercial dispute resolution institutions, be it court or arbitration. So, for instance, similar disputes when arise in Olympics will go to court of arbitration for sports. FIFA also goes for court of arbitration for sports. In cricket, I believe there is a dispute panel by ICC which handles the dispute between various national cricket associations. So there was, for instance, there was a dispute between BCCI and PCB, which is the Pakistan Cricket Board. That was ultimately resolved in favor of BCCI by the ICC dispute panel. Similarly, BCCI itself has certain specific dispute resolution mechanisms depending on the interstate cricketing association disputes and what kind of disputes they are. And it may be a BCCI ombudsman or a specific person designated by the BCCI to handle certain specific kind of disputes, which is within their rules and regulations. Now, whether you have a recourse to an alternate dispute resolution mechanism or you have a recourse to court will ultimately depend on what your underlying contract says, or depending on the kind of dispute you have, what your relevant sports authority rules and regulations say. And if ADR is not open to you, then obviously the only thing open to you is courts. Now, with this background, let's tackle the 3 or 4 questions that you had. I think the first one was, are courts in India open to hearing matters where there may be disputes around termination of contracts in today's situation? The answer is yes. Question is whether the reason why you're approaching court today is because you're seeking an urgent interim relief which can't wait till the courts finally resume 100% functioning, because currently the courts are not functioning at 100%. They're only hearing urgent matters. So if you have a case in which you want an urgent relief, you can approach a court. There are several examples of the Delhi High Court, Bombay High Court, even the Supreme Court taking up commercial disputes and giving urgent interim relief. The only thing that obviously you'll have to demonstrate is, I have an urgency, which is why I can't wait for another 1 month for you to resume your 100% functioning. There are cases in which cases which are at a final disposal stage relating to interim release from courts in aid to arbitration. Those cases are also being finally decided by courts now. Challenges to arbitral awards are also being taken up, provided they're at a final disposal stage. And all of this is happening through video conferencing, which kind of answers your second question, which is whether video conferencing is the way forward. So courts are only functioning in that manner currently in India. It's all happening through video conferencing. And I think in arbitration, video conferencing is not a new thing. It's been there for quite a few times. Obviously, it wasn't the #1 preferred option. Everybody preferred physical in-person hearings. But you and I have been part of disputes in which we've done teleconference hearings, we've done video conference hearings. All of that was much prior to the COVID times. But obviously, in today's day and age, when there are so many restrictions on travel, so many restrictions on having physical hearings, video conferencing is probably the only way forward in both court hearings as well as arbitrations. And I think to get to your last question, whether it will be sensible to approach a court in another jurisdiction, get an interim order because our courts are not functioning 100%, and then enforce it in India. Now, assuming there is no exclusive jurisdiction clause in your agreement and you can actually approach the court in a country outside India, within India, only final judgments from reciprocating countries are directly enforceable. That means interim orders are not directly enforceable. And what reciprocating countries are is also important. India only has 14 reciprocating countries at last count, 13 or 14. For instance, UK is a reciprocating country. A final judgment coming in from UK will be enforceable in India. US is not. So a final judgment coming from US is not directly enforceable in India. And for all other kind of enforcements, which are not directly enforceable in India, judgments and interim orders, you'll essentially have to again file a suit in India in any case. And you again have to satisfy the Indian courts on the same grounds that you would have had to satisfy had you approached the Indian court directly. So I think COVID within itself should not be a reason not to approach an Indian court for getting an interim relief, as long as you can demonstrate urgency and have a otherwise good case for seeking interim relief.
What I hear from you that this is a very nuanced way of looking things, and it's not going to be as cookie cutter as we would imagine it to be. So combined with whatever David has mentioned, especially for the global contracts, what Abhishek mentioned in terms of consequences of some of the termination events, and what Moazzam said combined, and how courts are really functioning and how things would move forward in case of a dispute, I think it's not crystal clear, I would say, but it does give you a very clear indication that as complex as it may be, live sports will need to live its journey through this year, and it is going to see hiccups on the legal side, and you are going to need a pair of really smart brains to actually take you through it. With that, I think we can move to the last bit of our session today, where I could invite maybe David and Abhishek to give their view from the UK law and the Indian law perspective, respectively. Any closing remarks on the way forward as and when sports opens up, and what are the things that they need to really take in mind? So if you could spend a minute each on that, that would be great. David, probably we could go with you first.
Okay, thank you. Well, look, obviously, at the moment, everyone is looking at the contracts, looking at the clauses, and as I said, in particular, there are negotiations going on between the premium sports governing bodies and the sports broadcasters. But looking further ahead, one immediate impact is I know that when I've been recently drafting new contracts, I've paid a lot more attention to the force majeure clause than I used to. But looking further ahead, I think whatever happens as between broadcasters, sports governing bodies, rescheduling of events, all sports, or almost all sports other than WWF, if you can call that a sport, are going to suffer a huge and in some cases catastrophic loss of income this year. And the question is, what are going to be the ramifications of that for those sports? And I think, in the absence of probably government support, and you've already seen the government providing funding to some sports in some countries, you are going to see clubs folding, becoming insolvent, and in some cases possibly whole sports not being able to continue. I think for the things like the Premier League, which is fueled by money, it's really the income that's coming in from the broadcasters that enables the clubs to pay the immense salaries to their players and enables them to pay huge transfer fees. When, for example, the Premier League rights contracts come up again for the next 3 years, which is in about 6 to 9 months' time, are the big broadcasters really going to be prepared, or will they even be able to afford to pay the same amounts as they have been? So if they're paying less and the sports are receiving less income, clubs will receive less income. So will we actually see, and a lot of people have been calling for this anyway, a reduction in player salaries, or perhaps salary caps, which you have in a lot of sports in the US? So I think it will cause a lot of sports to look again at their structures, and we'll probably see some fundamental changes.
Thanks, David. Abhishek, probably a few words from you as well.
Sure, Ranjana. So I think just looking at this a little bit from an Indian perspective, how things may look going forward. India being such a cricket-centric, cricket-heavy nation, and the IPL, as you mentioned earlier, being such a huge source of revenue generation even to the Indian economy, I think, as David mentioned, that in some form or way, there would be events, sports would have to come back, but a very critical element is the costs that are going to be involved on the level of the administrators themselves and individual clubs also. Because I think one key concern which sport across the world is going to need to address is player safety, especially in the next few years with the pandemic still being around and the risk of exposure to virus still being around. I think one very critical element that a lot of money is going to be spent on and needs to be spent on and addressed is ensuring that even though you hold your events in behind closed doors, you don't call fans in, testing of players, safety of players in contact sports, and even on the grounds when the events are themselves happen. And a key consideration which maybe also may lead to clubs deciding to fold and not incur the expenses, which is something also that they need to keep in mind, is what happens if something goes bad. Where, for example, you start up an event again and you have games going on for a week, and perchance someone catches the virus and maybe someone eventually does pass away. There are risks and exposures that still would stand to sport organizers from that aspect as well. So there's going to be a lot of change, a lot of money that comes into how sports in itself globally is going to look. And even in India, for that matter, maybe the IPL with government support and funding, if that's pushed in, might be able to organize or hold the event. But especially for other sports in India, which already require or lack funding from the government on a grassroots level, there may be long-term impacts from this, which they may not be able to come back.
Thank you, Abhishek. I think absolutely enlightening. Lots of food for thought for everyone to take away. And with that, gentlemen, we've come to the close of the session. You've been an absolutely wonderful panel. I'm sure the audience has thoroughly enjoyed themselves today. And I believe on behalf of NDA, Mr. Nishith Desai should also be online, and he'd like to give the vote of thanks before we would give the closing remarks. Nishith bhai, if you're online, if you'd like to do the vote of thanks.
Yes, absolutely. David, thank you so much. We really enjoyed, I was throughout on this, glued to this screen, listening to you and other panelists. I think great job. I think I'm so happy that we could have you with us today. And of course, Abhishek, Moazzam, and of course, Ranjana done a great job. So my compliments to you, and I think let us keep our interaction on. And with those words, I will not hold up the audience for too long. But I think even lawyers play, the sport of law. And we are adversaries in the court, but outside we are friends, like every other game. And it's thoroughly enjoyable. It's a sporting spirit is required everywhere. So I think, so far law is not treated as a sport, but it looks like, the elements of sports are definitely there. And, hopefully we'll have, another opportunity to have you all, and thank you so much. Thank you, Ranjana, once again for moderating excellently.
Thank you so much, Mr. Desai. And with that, on behalf of panel. Ranjana Adhikari here. I'm signing off and handing this over to my colleague Mamta Khatri